I'd just like to pass the microphone to Rich Schneider, who's our director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, CLACS or something like that,
Yep.
and professor of political science.
Great.
Thanks a lot, Rich.
Thanks, Timon. So this is the only thing between you and the end of the day, the end of the workday, the reception.
Yeah.
Okay. Session 4, Beyond Competition, ? New Directions in U.S.-China Relations in Global Climate Science and Policy. I'm going to introduce all the panelists, although I think we're missing one.
Yeah, I don't know where Deborah went.
Deborah Seligson?
She does need to catch a train at about 4:30, so I expected her to leave a little later
Okay.
than this.
Well, I'll introduce her. Well, she's been introduced already, but maybe
Yes,
I'll do
she
it.
has. Yeah, you can skip her.
Okay, all right, so let me introduce the 3 panelists who are here, and then we'll turn to the panel itself. So we have Mizan Khan, who is a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Management at the North South University in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And Mizan is a lead author of the IPCC WG3. I'm an outsider here, so I actually don't know what that acronym stands for. Raise your hand if you know. There we go.
That's a big deal.
You hear it.
That's a science.
Good. All right, and his research focuses on issues of equity in international adaptation politics, as well as national and community-based adaptation planning. He has served as a member of the Bangladesh delegation in climate change negotiations for 10 years. Deborah Seligson, if she shows up, will...
She's over here.
Oh, there's Deborah. Okay. Hello. So I will introduce her then. Deborah Seligson serves as a principal advisor to the World Resource Institute's Climate and Energy Program on issues in China, as well as to the China FAQ's China Climate and Energy Network. Deborah blogs regularly at www.chinafacts, that's FAQs.org, as well as working on a variety of issues connected on to both China and international climate policy. Her recent publications...
That's enough, because we already did
Okay.
a big long one this morning.
All right. Fair enough. And then, let's see, I've got Paul's information over here. We have Paul Smith, who's a professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College in nearby Newport, Rhode Island. His work focuses mainly on Chinese foreign policy and on non-traditional security issues related to Asia. He's the author of many articles and of the book entitled The Terrorism Ahead, Confronting Transnational Violence in the 21st Century. And then we also have Dr. Ming Zhu, who is a core faculty member at the University of Michigan Center for Sustainable Systems in the School of Natural Resources and Environment. He also holds a courtesy appointment with the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He works on developing industrial ecology approaches, such as environmental input-output analysis, life cycle analysis, which I gather we're going to hear a bit about in his presentation, and material flow analysis. And methodologically, he uses complex systems modeling, such as agent-based computational modeling and complex network analysis, to try to understand a variety of sustainability issues, including trade, energy systems, and urban systems. And then I'll just add, having grown up in and with the developing China, he says he has a natural interest in studying and teaching sustainability in China. So I want to ask the panelists to take 10 minutes each, and if you need 1 or 2 more minutes, we could probably work that in. But try to keep to 10. I'm going to be strict on time, so I'll give you a 2-minute warning, and then I'll give you a little indicator when time is up, and that'll allow lots of time for discussion at the end, hopefully. Okay? So we'll start, we'll follow the order of the program, which has Min Shu, right? First, and then we'll go to Deborah, Misa, and Paul.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How do we get this?
The video's muted up here.
Okay.
Wake up. Okay.
It's
I think I might have.
well. Let me just start. On the program, you saw my title was associate professor, but in fact, I'm just an assistant professor. So, but thanks for the promotion. I'm glad to accept that. So
We can
I
arrange that.
okay, good. So,
Thank you.
good, thanks. So my some of my research interest in part of my research interest in looking at the environmental consequences of international trade. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. So let's first give you some background. So trade is obviously very important. So this figure on the left shows portion of international trade measured at values and in a global GDP. We see a constantly increase proportional trade in the global GDP, and in 2009 there was a downturn, probably because of financial crisis, but immediately after that in 2010 it's coming back again on the same trajectory. So if you look at the individual countries, this chart here shows individual countries ranking in terms of import and export. So United States, world's largest import, China, world's largest export. And basically the entire world trade is dominated by those three countries, US, China, and Germany. So we are focused on China and the US today. So China-US relationship in terms of trade. This is a nice chart from Wall Street Journal last year, looking at the change of China's position, China's importance in terms of, for the US in terms of import and export. So right now China is third largest export destination for the US and the largest source for the US import in the world. Right? Obviously those two countries are not only connected with each other because of the political importance, because of climate, the role there, the role in terms of energy consumption and CO2 emissions, but also in terms of international trade. So the specific question I'm interested in is this so-called pollution haven phenomena or hypothesis. So when Larry Summers was chief scientist of the World Bank, there was an internal memo of his later released to the public. He said in his memo, he said, just between you and me, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the less developed countries? So the idea behind this is that in the developing countries, normally the environmental regulations level of environmental regulation is lower. So from economic point of view, you will obviously have motivation to move those industries to developing countries because of low labor cost. But from environmental point of view, that's something really bad because we essentially create more emissions at a global scale. Right? So the question I want to answer in my research is how much environmental impact have been caused by China's international trade, especially the US-China bilateral trade. And by environmental impacts, there are different types of impacts. For example, there are local or regional kind of impacts, hazard waste, air emissions, water pollutants, which their impacts are more like locally. But we also have global impacts, energy consumption, energy use. Energy becomes a global limited resource, and more importantly, CO2 emissions. Right? No matter, as we heard this morning, no matter where the CO2 coming from, Mother Nature doesn't care. They're all CO2 emissions. So this is CO2 emissions is what we're gonna focus on. But just to mention that our work also includes other types of impacts. So the kind of concept that we use is called life cycle analysis, LCA. So we heard another term, LCA. This is different from the LCA we heard this morning. So essentially looking at environmental impact happened because of consumption of certain product, not only the emissions occurred at the consumption phase of the product, also the whole life cycle of this making this product for consumption, from raw material extraction to processing to manufacturing to logistics to final consumption, and also for the end of life management. And as you can imagine, if you look at international trade, for example, material products manufactured in China and export to US for US consumption, this supply chain is very globalized already. So we might have raw materials coming from Australia and shipped to China, manufactured, processed in China, making final products and shipped to US for consumption, right? So, although when you use the products, you don't generate any emissions, but because you use this product and because the upstream manufacturing happened in China, you will have to use energy and as a result generate emissions. So this kind of energy emissions called emission embodied in trade or energy embodied in trade. So the result I'm going to show you in a moment, only because there's a limitation for this kind of research. The result I'm going to show you only consider as emissions occurred within the Chinese boundary, China country's boundary. So it had nothing to do with raw material extraction in Australia, perhaps if there is any material extraction in Australia. And essentially we use this economic input-output model as a core to simulate the whole life cycle of those products manufactured in China and export to the US. So this life cycle, so-called embodied emission, first of all, including direct emissions in making those products, but also including indirect emissions on the whole supply chain. So for example, if we're talking about a car, first of all, this result will include direct emissions in the manufacturing factories making the cars, and also include the indirect supply chain emissions in making metals, belts, wires for the engine, and making coppers, the plastic for the wires, and all the way back to the mining process for making for coppers, for example. And why this is important? First of all, a general rule is that in this whole life cycle of emissions for those kind of products, 80% of emissions coming from indirect upstream supply chain. So obviously this is most of the emissions coming from the upstream life cycle supply chain. So first, I want to show you some of the results we had. First one is China's carbon emissions embodied in China's export. So as a world factory, China export a lot of product to all the world, and what's the embodied emission in making those export products? So this is as you see, this figure shows a result from different year from different authors. This is a pretty crowded area for research, in terms of research. A lot of people looking at this using basically the same method, but using different types of detailed techniques to deal with those data, deal with those methods. As you can see, for each year, you will have a large uncertainty in terms of this estimation. But overall, we see a very consistent trend that the embodied emission of China's export is increasing. And so my question on this, on China's carbon emission embodied in total export, is to try to figure out for example, from 1997 to 2008, there is obviously an increase. What's the underlying drivers cause those increase? You can think, you might think about it's because of a population increase. Obviously, you have larger size of population, you will need to use a lot of large size of materials, and also perhaps because of the increased size of exports. You export more products, obviously you will generate more emissions, and also there will be technology development. Because technology development, energy intensity, carbon intensity will be decreasing, as we heard this morning. So all those factors, how those factors play together, generate this overall trend, and how much each factor can contribute in this overall trend. This is what we want to find out, and we use this structured decomposition analysis as a part of this, as an extension of this economic input-output model. So I'm not going to go into detail about this method, but basically we decompose this increase of embodied carbon emissions into 4 factors: efficiency change, carbon intensity change, and also economic structure change. In the economic structure, economic system, China economic system, some sectors growing, some sectors shrinking, so economic structure change, export structure change. Some products export more, and you export some products was export less. So the structure change in terms of export, and finally export scale export change. How much products you export each year, and how the change has been. So this is the result. This result shows the red bar over there shows from 2002 2007. There were like 1.7 kind of gigaton of CO2 emissions was incremental increase of CO2 emission embodied in China's export. And this 1.7 gigaton of increase was because of those 4 factors. In fact, for emission intensity, because technology improvement, emission intensity is decreasing. If you only look at the emission intensity change, it can actually reduce the embodied emission for like more than 2.5 gigaton. But because, wow, okay.
That gave you more time, actually.
I did too.
I will try to be quick. So because of the export composition change, so some products has been exported more, some product export less. Overall, you will see a 1.7-ish increase of CO2 emission embodied in trade. And what exactly in this export structure change has caused this impact? So we look at the different major category of export metal products. We see a dramatic increase of proportional export in terms of metal products. Because this is a very aggregate sector, and we look into metal products, what exactly which particular sector has caused this change. It's a steel pressing sector, which this sector represents a product like a steel sheet, steel slab, those kind of things. From 2002, 2007, the products export from steel pressing sector been changed over 20 times as compared to 2002. So this is basically the single most important factor driving China's CO2 emission embodied in trade, not the overall emission, but embodied in trade increase. So the last result I want to show you is proportion of the domestic emission in China in the U.S. How much is used for making products for another country's consumption? So those bars shows overall emission in China, U.S. U.S. on that side, China this side. The red bar shows embodied in, the green bar shows embodied in emission embodied in products export to another country. So China to U.S., U.S. to China. The red bar shows embodied to other countries, excluding China or including U.S. So for China, it's in 2007, it's almost like 0.5% of China's domestic emissions used for exporting products for other countries' consumption, and about 10% of the emission was used for because of the export products for U.S. consumption. And this is the previous slide only shows emission in the manufacturing process, but in fact there is also labor input as a part of the resources in manufacturing. So looking at the U.S. and China, in making the same value of product in different category, we need different number of workers. So this is a log scale. So China obviously needs much more workers in each categories than U.S. And on the other hand, each individual person in the U.S. and China, daily consumption averagely generate different emissions. So in the U.S., it's like 3.5 or 13.5 or 12.5 average Chinese workers or residents daily consumption generates same amount of carbon emission than the U.S. Resident. This is the life cycle result as well. So we include this labor input in this whole process, so expand the life cycle boundary. So this is the final slide I have to show how much labor related carbon emissions as compared to the how much manufacturing-related carbon emissions. So in the U.S., it's like 20 versus 80. In China, it's 30 versus 70. So on one hand, you have larger amount of more people working for produce same amount of products, but on the other hand, you have less consumption per capita basis. So overall, there's a trade-off, and this is the result of the trade-off. I think that's some final comments. So I think it's not fair to impose reduction responsibility purely based on production, but also not fair to impose this responsibility purely based on consumption, because export products to U.S. also generate employment opportunity and increase economic growth in China as well. So we have much to be done, but this carbon footprint accounting should be considered as a base of this discussion. And from there, we can figure out a way to how to allocate the responsibility. And also, there are things that change. And I think in America's, this small city in Georgia, right now they have a very booming industry which is making chopstick export to China, because China doesn't have a lot of resources right now. And on another hand, the recent economic magazine says about the end of cheap China. Labor costs in China increasing, a lot of manufacturing actually export to Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries. So there's things that change, and this whole picture will obviously change in terms of international trade and environmental consequences. And I apologize for the over delay. That's all.
I don't have slides, so I'll just
just take this.
the mic. So since is it on, actually? No. Okay. Is that working? Yes. Okay. So since I talked a little bit about overall stuff this morning, let me talk a little bit about trade this afternoon and comment a little on Ming's presentation. I think every side of this issue of trade-related emissions has at various times thought this was the trump card to get the other side to do what they want. And I don't think it's anybody's trump card. I think it's actually, it can either be sort of the most dangerous area of the negotiations, or it can be an argument for the kinds of domestic policy changes that countries like China, the United States, and Germany in particular have to do. For one thing, if we think about the percentage, I actually have some issues with the way trade-related carbon emissions are calculated, and I'm not sure from that presentation what kind of input-output table you used, or whether infrastructure winds up being included in trade-related emissions from China, because so much of the build-out of China's industry has happened in the last decade. And in a lot of the calculations that you had up on that board, but I haven't seen yours in detail, some of the roads and the ports and all the other things that serve the exports wind up getting calculated into the trade-related emissions. So there are questions about whether it's really 15% or really 25%, but either way, it's clear that China has net exports of carbon there. But if you remember back to the first slide, that's in part because China's economy has an enormous trade surplus, right? It's exporting a great deal more than it's importing. So when we look at China's 5-year plans and look at the intentions to rebalance and encourage domestic consumption, all of these would be ways that reduce the percentage of carbon that's involved in exports, because that would be rejiggering the economy. Similarly, the slide that you showed of the percentage of carbon related to trade in any way between China and the United States is not particularly surprising for two reasons. first of all, China is much more trade dependent than the United States is, and that's because it's basically followed an approach of export-led growth, and it's a much poorer country to begin with. But secondly, because China is so much more heavily industrial in terms of where its GDP is right now. Most of the US GDP actually comes from services these days. Services are inherently domestic. Or they mostly are. I think the US, of course, would prefer to have a little more trade in services than it does now. But if you think about a lot of things, including our great universities, medical institutions, et cetera, an awful lot of services are produced and consumed in the same place. So it's going to be the case that a country that's heavily industrial is going to have a lot more carbon in exports than a country that is much more focused on services. And that's where the Germany numbers stand out. In fact, in many ways more than the Chinese numbers. If you look at how large Germany's trade surplus is and how big its presence is in trade, and you consider how much a smaller country Germany is than China, it's interesting that the political rhetoric in the US is always about China and never about Germany, actually. So I think for both countries, it would actually be wise to pause and to think about the fact that if China did what it says it needs to do in terms of rebalancing the economy, moving away from this heavy industry focus to having a much greater focus on services and on domestic consumption, that would resolve some of the problems and reduce the feeling that it was simply being used as a source of dirty industry for the rest of the world, and provide more services that are good for local people. One of the things that always strikes me living in China and spending a great deal of time back and forth to the US is in both countries, what do people actually want? They want better health care, they want better education, they want a lot of better services, not a lot of better goods. And so if that focus on restructuring happened, it would be a benefit. Similarly, for the United States, as has been said for decades and decades, and whether the subject of ire is China or whether, as it used to be, Japan, for the United States, the fact that we have a trade deficit is mostly a product of domestic policy. It's not a product of what other countries do. It's a product of basically our enormous debt, right? So if we did what we need to do in terms of restructuring our own economy to focus more on balance within our economy, that would also solve that problem, and both of those things would happen without any need to think about border tax adjustments or all of these other things. I will say, in terms of thinking about Chinese policy, that while it often seems attractive to people who analyze this for there to be some kind of border tax or export restrictions, and it often seems attractive even in the United States. Well, if you're exporting a lot of high carbon things, why don't you just slap some border tax on it or whatever? When China actually does that, it creates an enormous amount of friction, as we've seen recently in the rare earths case. When they actually restrict the export of some carbon intensive product, remember, if you only restrict exports without dealing with the price domestically, it actually drives down the domestic price, and it seems to be giving an advantage to domestic producers over international producers, and it produces a great deal of trade friction. So it's also important to think about these things not as border issues, but as part of overall domestic economic policy, and thinking about whether it's a carbon tax or whatever policies you want to restrict carbon intensive manufacturing. It's far, far better if in both countries these things aren't thought of as border issues, but are thought of in terms of domestic policy. So I just think, as with every other issue in the climate discussion, none of them are simple, and none of these modes of analysis produce silver bullets, and I think that's worth keeping in mind. There've been a lot of misapprehension, I think, in the past, or wishful thinking that somehow climate was going to be an area where, oh, we can just agree and we're going to come up with some great plan and then everything's going to be great. This is an incredibly difficult issue that involves one of the most fundamental components of any economy. So every single one of these issues is incredibly tough. And all this information is really, really useful to the discussion. But I think it's also important to remember that none of it is going to create a simpler solution. It just adds complexity. And I think maybe I'll leave it at that. And I do want to apologize before everybody goes on that I'm going to cut out in the middle of this panel discussion because I'm going to run back to Boston for my Passover Seder. So I apologize that I'm going to walk out in the middle.
I warned them, so it's okay.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, moderator. I thank Timmons for inviting me as the lone representative of the LDC. And we have the big brother China in the Z77, the country that represents many here. So I will have few comments from the perspective of an LDC of what we expect from US-China relations. Bilaterally, US and China will do so many things. Since morning we have been hearing and I have learned a lot. Now, what that bilateral relation can or should result in the broader framework where other countries like LDCs and DOCs can benefit. Let me start with a comment about 200 years ago of French Emperor Napoleon. When the Qing dynasty was in decline, back in the beginning of the 19th century, he made a comment that the world should let China sleep because when she wakes up, she will shake the world. And actually China did that and is doing and will do in future. So now there are lots of schools arguing both for and against this bilateral, against this, the direction of this relationship. Some view that China-US will go kind of in an adversarial direction, some will go in a positive way. I personally believe that at least for the next decade, China-US relationship will go in the positive direction. Here, let me use the expression, very good expression, I liked it. John Gaddis, a political scientist, used the fratricide of contradictions and convergences, because contradictions will be killed by the convergences or similarities. And I believe that those similarities between US and China will reinforce the bilateral relationship. And since morning we have been hearing some of the similarities that let me mention. For example, as a negotiator, still I continue being with my government as a delegation member. For the last 2 years, especially from Copenhagen, I observed that emission power started ruling the game of climate diplomacy. Military power, economic power dominated the world. Now emission power started dominating the climate diplomacy. And there is nothing wrong in that. From LDC perspective, even as an academic, I welcome that. Because if the emission powers can reach an agreement, that is all the good for the LDCs and the OCs. Both also in the morning we have heard, both are very vulnerable from climate impacts. China's presentation we heard. As an academic, I have gone through some literature. We have seen Katrina. We have seen just 3 days before the tornado in Dallas, and the most probably $55 billion America lost in 2011 from the natural disasters. The National Oceanic Administration mentioned this data I saw in Climate Wire 2 days back. So, and then both are not just heavy fossil fuel gluttons. Oil importers and coal users, both also depend less on nuclear energy. Unlike in the industrial country, other industrial country counterparts, both depend less on energy. This is something good for us. But China is coming up with nuclear power more than America, because America is not doing that much. So these are the major similarities, and I think based on these similarities, China and America can do some things which the world will benefit. Number one, both China, you have mentioned, Professor Engling, that China has got poor people, more than 100 million. Yeah, it's fine, but one of your leaders once mentioned that China doesn't want any money for adaptation. And these LDCs will welcome this, because China as the big brother, if puts a hand on that little adaptation point, then we will be deprived. America also is positive, despite so many other things that we LDCs or AOCs don't support about America's policy. But in terms of adaptation finance, America is positive that public sources should fund adaptation more, because America experienced Katrina. Katrina hit Louisiana was not built by private money. So America knows that for adaptation, particularly in the LDCs and AOCs, public sources is the prime source, and for which we LDCs and AOCs stress for. So this is one thing where China and US can reach an agreement. And then from political science, we got to know that democracies don't make war. Okay, rarely in history, democracies made war. And China, to my mind, is proceeding towards the East Asian model of democratization. I visited China back in '98, immediately after my 8 years of stay in America. And then in '98, I saw China has got more or less an open economy. There is no communism in the economy back in '98, 14 years back. And I believe that based on the East Asian model of democratization, in next 10 to 15 years, China will be a democratic country in political sense. And then my question is, America is a democratic country, leader of democratic world, and then why, when the whole world trend is towards democratization, now let us forget about North Korea because it's a tiny dot and absolute outlier. Once China becomes politically democratic, then can't America and China thinking in terms of a bit of reducing military budget? Because both these countries have huge military budgets. Globally, more than $3 trillion are spent on defense. So when we are having a democratic revolution around the world, including the Arab world, which was kind of a very strong resistant area to democratization, they are having. So why to invest so much money on military defense? Why do we do military defense? Spending on military defense just for deterrence, as a deterrence, in case something happens. Okay, in case. And that precautionary principle is very much a part of the convention principles, Article 3.2. So, when we are quite sure, except for realist hegemonic purposes, military budget, but when we know for sure that wars will not happen, then why instead of investing so much money, we don't divert, USA and China don't divert a bit of money, defense money, to climate finance? Oh no. This is for the next generation of leadership who were sitting here before us. This generation may not buy these ideas, So this is one. And second one is that we are now struggling for finding out sources of money. Even the UN Secretary General has failed to pinpoint any specific source. His AGF absolutely has failed. The committee chaired by two leaders of the Third World War and British Prime Minister. They have failed. So why not to put a little, a minute fraction of tax on arms spending or arms trade around the world, more than $3 trillion. So even 1% or 0.5% or even 0.25% will bring about $125 billion or $150 billion, which is many times more than the climate finance that we have. Dave and IAED, and I am also a part of that. We are struggling for a few $1 billion. Without this kind of big thinking, never we are going to have a kind of sizable pot of climate finance, despite all this rhetoric of $100 billion or Green Climate Fund and all those, So, and another point is, both are users of climate coal, another similarity that I have mentioned. And back in 2009, in Petersburg meeting in St. Petersburg, or here somewhere, in the major economies forum meeting, those countries have agreed to reduce and end the subsidy to fossil fuel, to coal. Okay, so why not a fraction of that coal subsidy to be put to R&D for renewable resources? This is another kind of solution that America-China bilateral relations can have for the global benefit. And then free ridership in a multilateral regime, we have to tolerate a bit. 100% countries, will not come up to the board. 100%, yeah. Just I'll finish in 2-3 minutes.
2 minutes.
Okay. Back in '78, my advisor, professor, and one of my PhD program advisors, Professor Tom Sheldon, the Nobel Prize in economics, back in '78 has mentioned that a K group is, would be better for deciding this, solving this whole climate change problem. We from LDC welcome such a K group led by the duopoly or G2, as mentioned in the morning. This is another point. And then third point, next point is both China and USA are a bit, from our perspective, we see allergic to multilateralism because both countries are big, so they want to assert their independence in very cowboy kind of fashion. I'm an academic, so language might be a bit harsh, but and China is learning from America this because America, Woodrow Wilson, we are not having leaders like Woodrow Wilson. In America, we need leaders like Woodrow Wilson. So that multilateral framework, both China and America, if they cooperate a bit, then I think this will be a very good thing. And in terms of MRV also this sensitivity, a lot of sensitivity around that. From LDC and AOC's perspective, we strongly argue for a strong MRV, either for a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach, but a strong MRV is needed. Because you see, there must be and should be some kind of penalty. Canada, after signing and ratifying Kyoto Protocol, after all these years, now with 30% increase in the emissions, now you freely walk out. This should be a kind of shame, So some kind of penalty. So US and China as the K2 or G2 or duopoly can think of imposing some kind of penalty on the non-compliers if we want to succeed in future any regime. I'm not very optimistic, but these are the things that if we can do, then something may come up. So these are the main points that I wanted to highlight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nizam.
That was good. In the interest of time, I've taken a 14-slide PowerPoint. I'm going to show about 5 slides, so it'll be a lot quicker. First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. This has actually been a very good one-day workshop. I've really enjoyed it. And also, go ahead and get my slide up here. It's standard that we always give our little caveats. That everything that I say is my opinion only. It does not represent my employer. We always have to say that. It's standard, so just bear with me on that one. This morning it was fantastic. We had 2 speakers, including one of our lunchtime speakers, that compared the U.S.-China relationship using several examples. One was the bad marriage analogy. I love that one, that Chao Jia, inside the marriage, ma'am. And sir, you mentioned the State Department, my fellow civil servant, the 2 gangly, I think you used the term gangly or awkward kids at a dance, okay? Now, that's fantastic because I want to continue with that theme. And when I'm not giving presentations, I have several hobbies. One is putting together little films. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring that today. But the other is creating cartoons. This has become my new hobby. And I have this is my first cartoon in Chinese. And so I'm very nervous because I'm afraid, because we have native Chinese speakers, did I get it right or not? But I hope this cartoon kind of captures the essence of this question, captures the essence of the theme that we raised in the early morning. Okay, here we go, and I present it with great trepidation. Okay, is that the 中文还可以吗? Okay. Yeah, hi, okay. So if you're not a Chinese speaker, this means this is the Chinese side, you support the China threat theory. And you see that in Chinese literature often. And this gentleman or female, it's gender neutral, is saying you support the American decline theory. Okay, so they're screaming at each other. And I try. This is a little bit awkward, but they're on a deck on the Titanic. The Titanic represents the world, and so what I'm saying here, of course, is if the U.S. and China do not cooperate on climate change, the world will pay the price, because the U.S. and China are the two most important actors in terms of being culprits and also in terms of being possible solutions to the problem. And by the way, we live in a time, we live in an era, the early 21st century, in which we are confronting profound global challenges, profound global threats, from terrorism to piracy to disease to mass migration to climate change to proliferation, nuclear proliferation. And it requires that we have the global capacity to deal with these types of threats. And the critical aspect of that global capacity is the U.S.-China relationship. And that's what I'm trying to get at with this cartoon. But unlike my previous speaker right before me, who was more optimistic, I'm a little bit worried because of what I perceive to be growing military competition, growing geopolitical competition. And you know how this is going to go. If you're a student of realism and international relations, you know the playbook. We already know the script. We know how this drama plays out if it continues in accordance with history. We cannot allow that to happen. We cannot allow the moza, a situation that spins out of control, whether it has to do with the Senkaku Islands, whether it has to do with the South China Sea or Taiwan. And that's the real concern that I have. And after if I go through these slides here, you get a sense of the concerns that both of our governments have about rising military competition, the fact that we have repositioned our forces toward the Asia-Pacific region through the strategic realignment that we just announced early this year. In China right now, the big issue is 空海一体舰. Very concerned about that issue. And that's air-sea battle doctrine, an entire military concept which was crafted to deal with the problem of anti-access area denial, which is supposedly being put forth by China and other countries such as Iran. So that's a real concern. This is an internet page, and so it's all over the internet. A lot of concern about this particular issue. Also a concern that the U.S. repositioning of forces in the Pacific is directed at China, whether it's repositioning in Guam, changes happening in Okinawa or other parts of the region. There is this concern that the U.S. is out to contain China. I don't think that's correct. I think we are there to assure allies. But nevertheless, what we think and what they think, there's some discrepancy there. And it's creating an environment where cooperation on issues like climate change will become perhaps less possible in the future. Now, students of international relations, you're familiar with what's known in Chinese as 现实主义, okay, realism. And if you've studied realism, you know that states act in accordance with their interests. States are in a constant state of competition. And cooperation on global challenges, it sounds nice, but it's often very difficult to achieve in practice under this particular paradigm. I would argue that by and large, U.S. foreign policy is guided by realist precepts. I would argue that most of Chinese foreign policy is guided by realist precepts, with some exception. But we have to work around that and work around the issue of state competition. And I'll give you an example in history. Go back to 2001. Go back to 9/11. The U.S. and China had a competitive relationship prior to the 9/11 attack, and that changed afterwards. The U.S. and China found that they had common interests. They came together. President Bush went to the APEC summit in Shanghai, had some dialogue with the Chinese. The Chinese government offered up intelligence to deal with jihadi-based terrorism. And so we see a situation in history where a global challenge helped to ameliorate the state-on-state competition that was emerging before that time. And so some Chinese actually argue that the 10 years of the war on terrorism was perhaps the most peaceful time in U.S.-China relations in recent history. So could climate change become the new 9/11? That's why I asked the question earlier. Because to me, human civilization will not change its patterns of behavior unless there is a 9/11 type event. Climate change, the flaw about climate change is that it emerges in a protracted manner. It is a public policy disaster because people don't respond to protracted threats. They respond to acute threats. They respond to things like 9/11. So, and it's tragic to think like this because we don't want to imagine the notion, oh, we have to wait for some sort of 9/11 type event before people will take action on climate change. And I certainly don't wish that upon anyone in the world. But the tragedy, I mean, history suggests that you sort of have to have some sort of cataclysmic event, something that convinces the public that they have to take charge and they have to overpower the interest groups that Senator Whitehouse was talking about at lunchtime, that essentially co-opt the policy. So here, is climate change a global challenge or an existential threat? I would argue it is the latter, but it's very hard to convince people of that. That's a real challenge. Also, there is this notion of conspiracy, both on the U.S. side and also on the Chinese side. The notion that the climate change idea is a myth, it is under-researched, the jury is still out. Perhaps it's an inmo, a conspiracy to keep China down, to prevent China from developing. That's out there in Chinese literature. I actually have a book on that subject at home. And so that's something that has to be overcome as well. Also, the problems inside the U.S. with polling data suggesting less and less concern. Maybe that's changed recently. I only have 2010 data. That may have changed just recently. And also we have here where climate change is basically at the bottom of this hierarchy of issues. You can see other issues are considered much more important, including international terrorism. Having said all that, and I want to end on an optimistic note because I don't want to bring you down. We've had a great meeting. We've had some great exchange of views. One of the great merits of the current administration is they came into office with this idea of what I call the Global Challenges Engagement Strategy, or GCHES. And that is they identified these global issues with which China and the U.S. could find common ground. And that they articulated that in meetings in China in different places in 2009. And one of those, of course, was climate change. And another one was the energy security issue. And we set up these various initiatives with China on clean energy and Clean Energy Center and things of that nature. The administration has not dropped this, by the way. In fact, I found this article just recently, and this strategy is continuing. And I think that this is going to provide a way out of the security dilemma, basically focusing on global challenges, focusing on these global threats. But we have to change the perception of threats, because I actually think climate change is an existential threat, but it's also because it manifests so slowly, it doesn't sell as well as something like terrorism or something like nuclear proliferation. And so that's the problem. And also, sometimes the scientific community has a difficult time articulating the challenge or the threat in a way that public policymakers can actually use the information. There's often a gap there as well. But the bottom line is that the U.S. and China are a couple, and as the presenter this morning stated, a couple that has been married far too long, and they would love to get a divorce, but they just cannot afford it. And frankly, the world cannot afford it. U.S. and China are absolutely critical to addressing the climate change challenge. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. I guess we'll open up and say, I can't resist making a quick comment or two. I think both Paul and Deborah actually remind us about the nestedness of environmental issues and other issue areas. And in the hierarchy of issues, the environment is usually pretty low on the totem pole. I mean, the data you just put up showed that. Security is first, then the economy, be it issues of debt, finance, or trade. But at a minimum, it's important to think across these issue areas and just extracting the environment, disembedding it from its interaction with and linkages and delinkages with other areas is not a good idea. On realism, Paul, where are the ecological realists?
Well, it's not a very well-developed field. I'm working on it, though.
Okay. And-
Well, actually, that's not true. Thomas Homer Dixon, there's some scholars, there is a pretty large array of scholars. Alan DuPont, Josh Busby, others.
Yep. The human security crowd that links environmental threats to security very explicitly.
Yes.
Okay, a couple of other quick things, and then I'll open it up here. So, in hearing Mizan's presentation, talking about the democratic peace literature, that democracies don't fight democracies, it made me think about the relationship between political regime type, democracy, non-democracy at the broadest level, and climate change. Are democracies greener? You're shaking your head. I mean, if the Republican candidate to be, surely Mitt Romney, and wins, and the Tea Party line about the EPA is implemented, the Environmental Protection Agency will be abolished in this country. So that wouldn't be a very green outcome. I mean, it's a complicated question, but it's worth at least posing. What's the relationship between different types of political systems and climate change? And also, and then turning to, I'll give you all a chance to respond, to Ming Zhu's presentation on trade made me think about development strategies. And again, in the broad sense, open economy as opposed to closed economy strategies, right? The old ISI, import substituting, as opposed to globalized open economies. And if trade is browner than non-trade, are closed economies greener?
No, definitely not.
Well, let me pose a question. And one last thing. I mean, I think Deborah's point that there are no silver bullets is very well taken. But are there steel bullets? Your presentation showed that, you know, the contribution of steel exports out of China to carbon emission that was the big toe in the carbon footprint, or the heel of the carbon footprint. So one could imagine, you know, I mean, this would be reckless to advocate this, but thinking off your presentation, if you want to go for the jugular, have a targeted, you know, effect on reducing carbon emissions, you would focus on steel exports, perhaps. I don't know what the politics and complexities are, but the magnitude of the contribution there is notable. So no silver bullets, maybe steel bullets. Those are some reactions to what I just heard, and I'm happy to open it up or allow each of you to respond. But why don't we take some other questions, and then you'll each have a chance to respond. Although, Deborah, you have to leave when?
I have to leave in 15 minutes.
All right, okay, I'll keep that in mind. So, Dan?
Well, two different things. One on the point that came up from Ming Zhu's presentation and also Deborah's comments. Because I remember when I first went to work for the government, I worked for the National Marine Fisheries Service, important here in Rhode Island. The question came up one day because we'd taken over jurisdiction of our fisheries. We had an apple grower from Washington write in and say, you know, Japan won't open its markets to our apples, and therefore we don't want you to give them any fish in our zone. And so we want you to use the fish as leverage to make them open up the market to our apples. Yeah. And I had to respond to this letter. And you know, I'm a new kid, and I didn't know what to say, and I sort of thought, well, that makes sense to me. I mean, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And I remember all my bosses said, no. You have no idea. It is complicated enough dealing with fish. If you want to start mixing apples and fish and everything else on the planet in, you'll never be able to solve any problem. And I just want to make the comment here that the embedded carbon issue is a huge, vast problem. And it's very interesting to see Ming Zhu's presentation. But I think, at least in my experience, climate negotiators are kind of steered away from that up to now, because it is so, it's not as if everything else is so easy, we're looking for something else to do. I mean, that one, you mix that in, that's really going to complicate the process. And not that it's impossible, and not that people won't make those arguments as we go forward, but just it's a very, very complicated area. The other point I wanted to make has to do with Mizan's suggestions for how we might come up with money for things, because very creative and so forth. One of the problems that I see with adaptation that doesn't exist with mitigation. With mitigation, you have an opportunity to do something through, say, something like emissions trading or the CDM or something else, whereby you can see a benefit for a developing country and a benefit for a developed country through an activity, a trade or something, and there's money that flows from that. There's a win-win proposition. The problem with adaptation is adaptation benefits countries on a national, regional, local scale. There's no, unless you think preventing refugees from climate disasters and so forth is a global benefit, which it may well be, but traditionally people haven't thought of it in those terms. There's no compelling economic rationale that you can generate to show people how can I benefit from investing in adaptation other than locally. So the problem is
So the
that
political rationale may be stronger.
well, people have come up, the only way I've seen that people have come up so far, just conceptually, with a way to fund adaptation is by taxing something else. And that's exactly what happens under the Kyoto Protocol with the projects that go forward under the CDM. A share of the proceeds goes to adaptation. But there's nothing inherent in adaptation that generates the money itself. And to me, if you want to have an area for fruitful research for young people today going forward, trying to come up with a way to make this economic in someone's self-interest so that you could generate money for adaptation in that way, other than simply taxing some other activity, is wide open.
Other comments or questions at this point? Anybody? Yeah. Thank you.
I just have a quick question about one slide that Dr. Smith has showed a slide really quickly. I just want to ask, who are the group that's behind the argument that the entire this going green and protecting environment thing is just a plot, a emo? Who are the major supporters of this claim behind this?
Anything else before we turn back to the panel? Comments? Concerns? Yes, yeah.
Okay. Try to have some comments about the adaptation. You said you believe that adaptation is locally, not so widely to have the wide benefit like mitigation. I have an assumption in an area they are poor, then they make the efforts for their survival. Then there's resources for forest, the resources for the other vegetations. Then they try to spread the something for timing for the anything make maybe they could do anything they can for their survival, then destroy the ecosystem. Then a lot of GHG emitted. Then how do you think it's locally? It's local. Adaptation is local. Just for the narrow understanding, the narrow meaning of adaptation, it's local. But if you have the broad consideration, I repeated several times that especially in the ecologically vulnerable area in the poverty area, adaptation is the least cost to you have the least cost for mitigation to get the largest benefit from mitigation. Broadly speaking, it's like this. That's my consideration, my understanding for adaptation.
Great.
That's
Thank you. We have one more, and then one of our panelists has
Okay,
to go,
okay,
so we need
okay.
to allow her time.
Question
Carolyn,
was,
go ahead.
I have a question
you.
that maybe goes to Yin Wang's first presentation of the
Yeah.
day, where you had a slide that said China was going to prepare to adapt to a rise in global average temperature of between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
And I find that notion of adaptation alarming, as do many ecologists, because at 2 degrees Celsius, we really have committed ourselves to really some what are called sort of endpoints where it's very difficult to go backwards. So adaptation is probably something that ought to be unpacked here, whether or not we really want to try to adapt a 2 to 3 degrees Celsius increase in global average temperature. And then I want to ask whether any of you have an opinion. Well, let me back up. Somebody today said that the WTO should be brought in as a possible deal breaker, as an institution that could help negotiate agreements between China and the U.S. And so I want to ask whether you as a group have opinions about the current looming trade war between the U.S. and China with respect to photovoltaics. And I'm guessing you've probably followed some of this so I'm curious what you think of that, where China is accused of dumping very inexpensive photovoltaics, meaning Americans can afford it, use PV, get off the grid, which is in theory very good for climate, but we're about to have a trade war over it. So I'm curious if you could just address some of those, whether or not we should be adapting to a 3 degrees Celsius planet or mitigating, and the role of trade in all of this.
Great. So let's allow Deborah to begin, since she's got tight time constraints. We'll hear from the others.
So, a couple of comments. First of all, I don't think anybody could argue that democracies emit less, since all of the major emitters on a per capita basis are democracies. On a per capita basis, rich countries emit more than poor countries. And I think that's the only thing that we can say quite definitively. But the large sort of resource-dependent countries with large distances, like the United States, Canada, and Australia, definitely emit a lot more per capita and have specific challenges. And I'm really hopeful that people in the U.S. will be looking at the Australian model and seeing if Australia can, as resource dependent as it is, can really have a serious cap and trade program that maybe that can inspire us. What was interesting, I was at a conference recently in China where there was a lot of interest in how the Australian cap and trade program was going, and I think if China's looking at it closely, hopefully we can too. On your question about steel, I think that was precisely what I was trying to warn against. It's that trying to do these things as sort of single focus commodities that are distorting of trade makes things worse and tends to create more political friction. And that if you just look at, for example, eliminating subsidies and trying to sort of rationalize the economic playing field, in this case in China or in the United States, if we thought about fossil fuel subsidies in the same way, that would be a solution that would actually help rebalance both economies without creating additional frictions. Because when one looks at it, there's a lot of steel exported, then you put an export tariff on it, which you can do in China. You just can't do that in the United States because of the uniqueness of our constitution. And that drives down the price domestically, and it creates a whole bunch of other distortions. And if steel is cheaper domestically, of course, then you're likely to use more. So it's not clear how that works. But if you think about it as why is it so cheap that people are selling so much for exports, then you get to the underlying subsidies, and then you might actually be able to solve the problem much better. I think when we talk about the looming trade war, I've been working on US-China stuff now, for a long time, more than 20 years. And there's always a looming trade war between the US and China. And so, these things get managed. They get managed pretty well, actually, in bilateral trade negotiations. At one point in my career, I actually worked on US-Canada trade relations, and we actually have more conflicts at any given time with Canada than we do with China. And at least back in the 90s, they made the news often, but people didn't pay attention to them. In the same way as we don't talk about these Western companies as countries when they invest in Latin America, we don't talk about trade disputes with Canada as being about Canada, but it's about the lumber industry or the beer industry or whatever the latest dispute is. Between the US and China, they always become these big sort of things that represent the whole country instead of specific sectors and specific problems. And I suspect this one will get negotiated and managed, and that's what the WTO is for. But what I don't think the WTO is for is solving environmental problems. And I think trying to use trade as a trump card to deal with these issues is really dangerous, actually, and will move away from the kind of cooperation that Paul held out at the end as sort of the hope that, and so that's what I sort of think is the road that we really don't want to take. And finally, on all this discussion about adaptation, I think when China says that they need to adapt to 2 to 3 degrees by 2050, I think they're being fairly realistic about the state of the negotiations, right? I mean, there's a 2-degree goal, but so far the commitments made don't add up to 2 degrees. So if you're sitting in the Ministry of Agriculture, you better be thinking about what happens if they don't make it. And so that just seems like reasonable precautionary principle on the part of the adaptation planners. Needless to say, it would be a much, much better solution if you don't get to that point. And that's why I think they brought 140 people to Durban. And it's also, as you go through the exercise of what does it take to adapt to 2 to 3 degrees, it probably enlists a lot more people into actively pushing for mitigation, because you realize what a large task that really is. So I think it would actually be helpful in the United States if every community were thinking about what would 3 degrees mean to us, because it might actually push efforts forward. And in terms of adaptation funding, what I would suggest, I maybe there will be somebody brilliant who comes up with a way to make it pay for itself, but I suspect if we could get some agreements on mitigation and have a feeling of forward progress, that getting a bunch of money for adaptation would actually be no more difficult than it was to get a lot more money there for the global AIDS effort early in this millennium. That it was very, very easy to reach out to a lot of constituent groups in Washington, the churches and a lot of groups that are very interested in the poorest of the poor, to talk about adaptation finance. And when that issue, if that issue were really the main issue that needed to be solved, I think finding a group of allies who are concerned about the fate of least developed countries would actually be relatively simple, because I think Professor Hsu is right that the amount of money needed to make a huge difference would not be on the same order as transforming whole energy systems. And so it's a question, we keep coming back to this question that there are too many issues on the table. And so they all get obscured and they get mixed up, and everybody thinks that their issue is going to be sort of the perfect trade-off. But if we could solve some of these big issues and help people feel there's forward momentum, I think all it would take is a political leader saying, we really want to put this money out there, and you could do for adaptation what you did for AIDS.
Great.
And I apologize for speaking and running, but I am going.
Great, thank you. Very helpful comment. Let's give the other members of the panel a chance to reply, and if there are more questions, we can do another round. So let's go. Yes.
All right. First of all, I want to thank Dan for acknowledging the complexity of this problem here. And the whole climate change discussion is a complex problem, but also not only looking at this carbon footprint counting analysis field, it's also a very complex problem. As you saw from one of the slides I showed, same year, same carbon footprint estimate. Different authors have very different results, although they are using exactly the same method, perhaps exactly the same database. But it's just a lot of those detailed, small technicals, you dealing with those data, people have different opinions, different methods. So that tied to one comment Deborah made about if our results include the infrastructure investment Chinese government made. We all know that in the past decade, Chinese government made a lot of investment, huge investment in terms of infrastructure development. And the answer for that is yes. This method, this model actually includes not only manufacturing sector but also service sector, and also not only the economic sector per se, but also the government investment as a kind of one sector. So in theory, everything happening within the economy is included. So, for example, making this one bottle product, because it triggered production from upstream suppliers, but also triggered the investment made by government in terms of infrastructure. And another comments we heard about is, Richard, you said if the closed economy is a better way to make this thing work. Well, my answer is that this is not the kind of work we did is not try to argue that this is not fair for China or not fair for the United States. It's not a fairness problem. It's just the way those industries allocated right now. It's kind of natural selection because of economy. There's low cost over there. It's natural you go there and utilize those low costs. But the two problems that, well, actually just one. First of all, because of the carbon emission is a global emission, which we have to address no matter where the emission comes from. And so the kind of work the main purpose of the work we did was, well, first of all, we all know how important the export is to China, to the United States, and also how important those export for the whole carbon emission. But exactly how much important? So that's the kind of purpose of our work, try to exactly quantify how much the emission involved in trade. And there's another one comment related to steel, right? So we're not suggesting, in fact, in our paper, we're not suggesting that you impose a trade tariff or quote on steel export, but instead, the Chinese government should focus on technology development in the steel sector to improve energy efficiency. So there's absolutely no point to restrict the export of one particular product because that can cause cascading impact on the economy, and in a lot of cases can shift to the environmental impact from one particular sector to another sector, which is not the desired outcome. But instead, I think in any way we should focus on the technology development in terms of improve energy efficiency.
Thank you.
I have quick comments on three issues. Whether democracy goes together with greenness or green politics. In fact, it's difficult to support. Even environmental Kuznets curve is being disproved. For example, experience in the developing countries like China or India, where emission intensity has gone down much more than the industrial countries. During the last decade, emission intensity in developing countries overall has gone down 30%, but in the industrial countries only 12%. So here it's a bit difficult to match democracy and better outcome in terms of environmental result. Second point that Dan, you have raised, in fact, I, as an LDC negotiator, have been thinking for the last 2 years of this idea. Because, you know, climate change is global in nature, both in its cause and effect dimension. Okay, but cause is being taken care of because they are mutually, mutually beneficial. But the effect of that undersupply of mitigation is not being taken care of. From conceptual point of view, as you have mentioned, that adaptation is not a national and a global good, not a global public good. There is some tragedy in that, because of the undersupply and antecedent deposition of greenhouse gases, historically or whatever, At least from the 90s, for example, industrial countries should recognize this responsibility when knowledge became known absolutely. Okay, and then it is not being taken care of. The effects, climate change impacts, for which adaptation is needed. That is why, in fact, me and Timmons, we have submitted an article as a chapter of a book on these, how to enhance the legal basis of adaptation regime. And I have submitted a book proposal to Ralph Ledge and Arthur Scan, and initial reactions are positive that I will write a book on that, how to codify kind of adaptation, because on charity you cannot depend on. This is something right, and in human history, rights, evolve in a staged fashion, starting with political, civil, political, economic rights, and then environmental right as a lens is becoming increasingly very strong. And my argument is, after so many 20 years, the agenda of loss and damage that AOCs started hammering on since 91 was not agreed by the industrial countries. But in 2010, in Mexico, industrial countries agreed, and UNFCCC included it as an agenda of loss and damage. My interpretation is why? Because now, all over the world, across the subnational, national, and international level, adjudication and liability cases are coming up. In America, you had quite some successful court cases. Number one is the Massachusetts versus EPA. Okay, so both the governments around the world and the private sectors are a bit getting scared, because through litigation they have to pay millions and billions. But if through negotiation of loss and damage something can be done, then the amount will be less. So this is good as an incentive both to the government and to the private sector. Okay, thank you very much.
Just very, very briefly on the conspiracy email issue. That comes from a report, that particular quote that just got published by Brookings Institution by Kenneth Lieberthal and Wang just says supposedly that is supposed to be reflecting elite opinion inside the leadership circles inside China. I can't answer your question about how widespread that is. I mean, is it like 30% of the population believes that? I'm sure a large segment of the population does, just like in the US and perhaps other countries. But I should be able to get better data in a week, because I'm going to Shanghai on the 15th. So get back to you later, I guess. And then the other issue is, I won't deal with the trade issues, I think it's been addressed, but adaptation, I think there's a certain false comfort to the notion of adaptation, because what happens in abrupt climate change? What if it doesn't just go up 2 or 3 degrees centigrade, maybe perhaps 5, 6 degrees? And I think that's what concerns me a lot. And another issue that hasn't really come up, and perhaps it shouldn't come up, is geoengineering. Once it becomes obvious that this is a huge threat, I think there's going to be pressure to do geoengineering, human manipulation of the climate type issues, and we have as far as I know, no legal regime to address that, and that will possibly instigate state-on-state suspicion, conflict, or competition at least. That's
Let's take another round. I saw a number of hands up. So you here? Yes?
Just, in fact, some reflections and observations. Thank you for all of you. I found all your presentations extremely interesting. Reflections first about the trade. I totally agree with them. And as UNFCCC so far, I think, has successfully excluded trade into the negotiation of UNFCCC. Otherwise, it not go anywhere. And also, I remember that back a number of years ago, I co-authored an article about equity and we talk about also trade, arguing exactly that if you look at production or look at consumption. But again, in the end, the equity is in the eyes of the beholder. You argue different ways. That's not really linked anywhere. So that's really, I would say that there's still some. And also your study also shows that how complicated if any country want to impose so carbon tariff, it's just impossible. How you measure carbon, how you this embedded product, it's just impossible. So Sam, and thank you very much for offering that the view about how from the least developed countries to look at this big G2. And I found it really very interesting that from your point of view, because sometimes the two countries I have to so obsessed with themselves and obsessed with each other. They almost forget the rest of the world. And so how you, the message I took from you that you really like to say this G2, at least in the climate change or other areas, working together to find solutions.
Exactly.
I think that's certainly it's, I would say it's a very positive signal. Then you're back to Paul. That's whether climate change can be a strategic topic that links these countries together. I would think that unless you say we have seen that the real actions taking place in China on the ground, but I would think in the U.S. unless the whole domestic situation change, and I just don't know how really put them in the same track. And I really hope that if the new election, if the U.S. can put in place the climate legislative in the future, we may see really with a positive synergy between these two countries to drive their agenda together. But I also like to back you show a lot of pictures about threats. It's kind of scary about because we have heard about this inevitable conflict between those two countries. Of course, people look at history, how the emerging power or have to challenge existing power. We have all heard about this. And so I just listening to your presentation, I follow this whole this parallel we have drawn this morning about marriage. When you have bad marriage, when you come out close to blink, normally for at least I know many couples, instead of taking this corrective action to take the court to divorce, they somehow go to marriage counseling, right? Trying to find a way to work with. So I'm just thinking that this relationship between the two, they just talk to you, and maybe they cannot really communicate. Is there any kind of mechanism similar to marriage counseling? I mean, to find a way that before they go there, that some kind of consultation or could make these two sides come down. Just so.
Yeah. So you need a couch on the deck. What, were there other questions? Timon's hand was up, and Carolyn, you had a hand up earlier, but are there other people who haven't had a chance to speak who would like to?
I've got a couple
Go ahead.
just quick ones. One actually relates to your point, Shuiman, which is when I had Dan Reefsnyder come talk to my class when I taught at William & Mary, and he gave a public lecture as well. It was during the Bush administration. And you were talking about how we were unlikely to solve this problem through the United Nations because it's 194 countries. And you described 5 or 7 different initiatives that were regional, including Pacific Rim ones and some technology, ones, and so on. I guess this gets to the question: is are we better solving this with a G2 or with a G, with two alliances, between the sort of high ambition group, as they're being called now, the island states, the LDCs, and the EU, and and this other group. I guess I'd like to hear Dan's thought on that. I have a lot of questions, and then anyway, I'll just ask one more right now, and that's for Paul. Are there scenarios being played out in the greater minds of the military establishment on things like geoengineering and whether that would involve a likely conflict between the U.S. and other military powers over who gets to do it, or are there scenarios about stopping somebody who might try to seed the atmosphere or the oceans?
Other questions, discussion? Anybody?
I have a general question about the role of scientific information and technical information in the negotiations. Because what I hear is resistance to bringing in this kind of embedded carbon information into a negotiation, but to me, I find those kinds of data helpful, revealing. And it also strikes me there's the same resistance to bringing in sort of the current information on, for example, the commitment to increasing global average temperature if we don't mitigate. And I'm just curious about the role of science in negotiations then.
I'm going to pose another question. What is geoengineering? And I found Dan's, and then she's gone, of course, with Deborah's response to Dan's initial point, very interesting. Just the idea that pieces of the problem, and at the gross level, the problem, climate change, mitigation, adaptation, may have properties that make them harder or easier to solve at different scales by different actors. And your claim is that, well, maybe something about adaptation that makes it less amenable to self-financing than mitigation. I mean, the incentives for business, for companies, for whoever to innovate are different. You said because of the local nature. Well, there's some actors who have very local incentives. I mean, people, for example. Maybe not multinational companies, but politicians, local, it depends on, federal systems different from a unitary system. But just the idea that, the properties of the challenge of the problem may, may influence the economic and political incentives for tackling it. I think that's worth repeating. And I'm glad I come out of this with learning the answer to my question, and I didn't pose it the right way. Are democracies greener? No. But the question should have been posed, can democracies be greener? And if you just think of a two-dimensional property space where one is green, brown, and the other is democracy, not democracy, there are brown democracies and brown dictatorships, just as there are green democracies and green dictatorships. But the nature of democratic solutions to the problem of brownness or to climate change, those are different from non-democratic solutions. And there are a variety of those. And it's worth thinking about that variance. And it's a very aggregate way of posing the issue. But anyhow, so let's hear from our three panelists, and maybe let's just go in the order. Oh, there's another question?
Sorry.
Oh, please, yes.
One last thing that I feel hasn't been mentioned. I'm just wondering about China's growing interest in unconventional energy sources, especially Canadian and Venezuelan tar sands. I'm not sure if anyone can comment on this, but I feel like throughout the day we've been hearing a lot about how China has been leading in renewable energy technologies as well as energy efficiency. But on the other hand, it also seems like China is becoming more interested in energy sources that are vastly more carbon intensive than conventional sources. So I wonder if anyone can speak to that.
Great. Last chance to raise a question. Going. Okay, so let's hear one more time for our panelists, and then we'll close. And I guess we'll go in the order in which you're presented again. So we'll start.
First of all, I have to thank Shumi again for acknowledging the complexity of the carbon footprint work, but I have to argue that it's not impossible. It's doable, but it's just difficult. So a lot of technical details, issues need to be resolved, but it's definitely doable. And the other question. The other question I forgot to mention last time about the trade war, currently mentioned. There are a lot of reasons in the United States people think about trade. Some of the trade is not fair, it's because of the trade law. And looking at Mitt Romney, it seems like if he takes office, he will start a large-scale trade war with China. But I'm not a U.S. citizen. I don't vote. So from outside point of view, I don't think he will actually do that, and I don't think he will be able to do that, even if he would want to. It's a natural selection of economy, where the material, where it's located, and where the low labor cost located. So, but one thing we're missing here in this discussion about trade war is the benefit of low labor cost in developing countries in making those so-called climate technology or renewable energy technology. because of low labor cost, because of low whatever cost, it can make a production to scale and drive the cost down dramatically. And from global point of view, it can help the global diffusion of those technologies, and that's good for the entire world. So if we, on the US side decision-making process, if we taking into account that piece of factor, maybe there will be a different perspective from that. Regarding China's effort on non-conventional energy, China obviously made a lot of investment in terms of renewable energy. In 2010, I remember there were reports said that China was the largest investor in the world in terms of renewable energy, mostly because of wind energy. But if you go to China, to a lot of those wind farms, those wind turbines are just running separately without connecting to the grid. So the investment has not been transformed to actual benefit to make the grid greener. And recently, the very recent Chinese People's Congress has decided that in the next 5 years or next year, they have to restrict the capacity of PV and wind turbine manufacturing because it's already overcapacitated. And I also think there is a recent trend that China has been focused on nuclear energy. That's for a long time. There is a recent trend that China has been focused on very dramatically in terms of shale gas, which is as considered another strategic energy supply for China in recent time. But as we all know, shale gas, the whole process of making that available for energy use have a lot of environmental impact, especially water impact, pollution in water. And water pollution is already a serious problem in China. So we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But I think that's something we need to keep an eye on.
Again, the question of democracy versus greenness is very, very difficult. But I think categorical answer is not very easy, because for climate change is the biggest wicked policy problems. In the sense, it's multi-scalar, multi-sectoral. Each and every citizen sectors are involved. So I think whatever building blocks we have from the bottom up, there is a need, undenying need, for a central coordinating body. The look of that body might be debated, but a central coordinating body is needed to look after those building blocks, starting from the community, nationally, locally, nationally, and internationally. China's example shows that centralized management is better for greenness at the moment. I have another little comment about 2 degree centigrade. This 2 degree centigrade business kind of has become, it has reached kind of a numinous status, this number. But I personally, as a country which is can be regarded as the poster boy of vulnerability, this 2 degree centigrade doesn't have any meaning for us. It's a global average, and nobody experiences this statistical average. In some parts of the world, there will be 4 degrees, 5 degrees, even 6 degrees centigrade higher temperature in some African region. In Bangladesh, at least, if globally there are 2 degrees, we will have at least 4 degrees centigrade. So this 2 degrees, maybe it's a common indicator for negotiations, but for individual countries, we don't have any meaning. Already, the deposited commitments, bottom-up commitments at the UNFCCC Secretariat, scientists have reached the conclusion that at least 4 degrees, warming will be. So we have to be better careful, and using these numbers. Thank you.
Just very quickly, 2 degrees C has ecological meaning. So they increased to 2 degrees C global average temperature has ecological meaning for the world ocean. So oceanographers believe at that level we start dissolving coral
I know, that is a global average.
Right.
But regionally it will be different.
Correct.
Just briefly on geoengineering. I believe you're going to hear more about this. I think geoengineering is potentially very dangerous. Mitigation would be much preferable, but the problem is, of course, given some of the difficulties in achieving effective mitigation, there's going to be, I think, pressure to at least explore geoengineering, otherwise known as climate remediation, one form of which is solar management, where you essentially manipulate the amount of solar energy that gets into the Earth's atmosphere. Stratosphere and troposphere, through various means. I mean, there's all kinds of techniques. There's different ways to do that. The problem is, I don't think we fully understand the climate system, and therefore we start manipulating with it, and we may end up causing something that we did not anticipate, triggering another ice age. We don't want to do that. So obviously, the other issue that's related to in terms of gaming, military, I do not know of any such games. There may be what I call war games on geoengineering, but I do know that the military is very interested in the problem of extreme weather and its effect on political systems. And the what we call HADR, Humanitarian Assistance Disaster Response, which is increasing as a role for the military, and particularly the Navy. If you go back to a good example, I can't say this is climate change, but if you go back to 1997-98 financial crisis in Southeast Asia, it occurred alongside and what's called ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation event. So they had drought, and you had all kinds of bad, extreme weather, drought, heat waves, and it had a negative impact on crops, and it was devastating. So you had a double whammy. You had a currency crisis combined with a weather crisis during that period. And it had political effects. It caused regime change in Indonesia. It almost toppled other governments. So we see definite examples of where extreme weather events do have political effects. If we see an increase in food prices, let's face it, one of the causative factors of the Arab Spring or the Arab awakening was increased food prices. And historically, we know that whenever food prices increase, it tends to correlate with regime stability, social stability, those sorts of things. So that's something to worry about, because that sort of connection to the agricultural sector is very critical. The reason I'm saying that is because those are the types of scenarios that we do war games on. And it's very realistic. The Navy's been at the forefront of doing those sorts of studies.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to 5. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a lively session.